Right now, there are, millions of children growing up in the global south whose mothers are raising entirely different children thousands of miles away.
Yeah, in cities like Los Angeles or Rome or London.
Exactly. The modern global economy basically relies on this invisible cross-border reality every single day. A wealthy two-income household in the global north can only really function because they've outsourced their care work to a woman from the global south.
Right, who is then sending a fraction of her wages back to her sister or her mother to raise her own child.
Yeah. Yet if you look at a standard, brightly colored map of the world, with its neat black borders separating countries like these airtight boxes,
Yeah.
none of those deep bleeding connections exist. The map just tells you that Philippines is over here, Italy is over there, and they are completely separate ecosystems.
Which is, frankly, a profound illusion. And that illusion is exactly what we're dismantling today.
Yes, we are. Welcome to the deep dive.
So today we're looking at a totally paradigm-shifting text from 2008 called the Transnational Studies Reader, Intersections and Innovations. It was edited by sociologist Peggy Levitt and political scientist Sanjeev Khagram.
And we should say, this isn't just some dry textbook, right?
Not at all. It was a highly calculated intervention into academia because before this book, you had anthropologists studying migrant villages, economists studying foreign direct investment, political scientists looking at treaties.
They were all touching different parts of the exact same elephant.
Yes.
Yeah.
But because they were trapped in these isolated disciplinary silos, nobody could see the whole animal. So Levitt and Khagram gathered the foundational essays of the previous 2 decades and wove them together.
They basically created a unified lens for seeing how the world actually operates.
Yeah.
And honestly, for anyone listening right now, this isn't just some academic exercise for people in ivory towers. This is about the water you are swimming in.
You are living a transnational life, whether you realize it or not.
Exactly. When a supply chain bottleneck at a factory in Taiwan dictates the price of a used car in your neighborhood, or, when a political conspiracy theory born on a server in Eastern Europe triggers a protest in your local town square, you are experiencing the failure of national borders to contain human activity.
The borders just leak constantly.
They do. So we are going to give you the toolkit today to actually understand these forces rather than just being buffeted around by them. But to do that, the editors argue we first have to unlearn a very specific, deeply ingrained bad habit.
Systemic blind spot.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is this blind spot?
So drawing heavily on critiques by scholars like Andreas Wimmer and Nina Glick-Schiller, they diagnose this blind spot as methodological nationalism.
Methodological nationalism. Okay, break that down for us.
Well, to understand why it's such a stubborn disease in the social sciences, you really have to look at history. The disciplines of sociology, political science, economics, they largely came of age in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right, which is the exact same historical moment that the modern nation-state was really solidifying its power in Europe and the Americas.
Exactly. The academic disciplines essentially grew up holding hands with the nation-state.
So the researchers just absorbed the assumptions of the governments that were funding their universities.
Yeah, pretty much. Methodological nationalism is this ingrained assumption that the nation-state is the natural default container of all social life. So if a 20th century sociologist wanted to study inequality, they automatically studied inequality within the United States or within France.
Because they just assumed the political border of the state was identical to the boundary of society itself.
Right. The state was the laboratory. Anything outside the state was considered this completely separate foreign system.
Okay, wait. So is this basically like trying to study the ecology of a river, but stopping your research exactly at the invisible state line drawn on a map?
That is the perfect way to look at it.
Like, you trace the river through Colorado, and the second it crosses into Utah, you just drop your clipboard and assume the fish and the currents have magically started operating under Utah's independent ecological laws.
Which is completely absurd.
Right. A river doesn't care about a surveyor's line on a map, and human social networks don't either.
And that river analogy captures the exact frustration Wimmer and Glick-Schiller were expressing. When social scientists use that artificial container to measure borderless phenomena, they don't just get incomplete data.
They get actively misleading data.
Exactly. They misdiagnose the root causes of economic trends and political movements because they are artificially truncating their field of vision.
Okay, I hear the theory, and I love the idea of this borderless flow, but let's pressure test this a bit.
Sure.
Because if I walk up to a customs checkpoint at an international airport and I'm holding the wrong passport, or worse, no passport at all, that invisible line suddenly becomes an incredibly real, physical, sometimes violent barrier.
Oh, absolutely.
So does this academic critique run the risk of ignoring the immense coercive power that states still wield? I mean, it's easy to say borders are an illusion when you're a tenured professor with a blue passport.
That is the crucial tension of the entire field. And the editors do not shy away from it at all. They actually include the vital work of anthropologists Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson for exactly this reason.
To provide a reality check.
Yes, a massive power check. Gupta and Ferguson argue fiercely against this utopian, romanticized vision of a borderless world where everyone is just some global citizen freely mixing cultures.
Right, because capital and information might glide frictionlessly across borders, but human bodies definitely do not.
Precisely. The state hasn't vanished. It has become a selective filter. And to understand how people actually navigate that filter, the book anchors itself in some foundational 1990s research.
This is the work by Linda Bash, Nina Glick-Schiller, and Christina Zanton-Blanc, right?
Yes, these three scholars completely revolutionized migration studies. For a century, the dominant narrative was basically the Ellis Island model.
You pack your bags, you cross the ocean, you arrive, you assimilate, and you sever your ties with the old world. A totally one-way trip.
A total reset of your identity and your geography. But in the 90s, they looked at the data and realized that model was dead. So they introduced this concept of transmigrants.
Transmigrants? How's that different from an immigrant?
A transmigrant doesn't sever ties. They build and sustain complex, multi-stranded social relations that simultaneously link their society of origin and their society of settlement.
So they exist in both places at once.
Right. They occupy what these scholars coined as a transnational social field.
Okay, let's make that concrete for someone listening who might be taking notes for an undergrad class or just trying to wrap their head around it.
Yeah.
A transnational social field isn't just, sending a postcard home at Christmas.
Definitely not.
It's like someone physically living in an apartment in Brooklyn, but their primary economic life is managing a small agricultural export business back in Jamaica.
Yeah.
And their political life involves intensely lobbying and fundraising for a mayoral candidate in their Jamaican hometown. And maybe their family life involves daily video calls to discipline teenagers who are being watched by grandparents back in Kingston.
That is a perfect illustration. They are occupying a single, dense social reality that just happens to be stretched across a couple thousand miles of ocean in a sovereign border.
The social field completely ignores the geographic boundary.
It does. But bringing it back to your earlier pushback about power, the ability to maintain that social field depends entirely on your status.
Right. Who gets to cross and on whose terms.
And this is where the anthology gets incredibly stark. The editors deliberately place different lived experiences side by side to show how wildly uneven this transnational landscape actually is.
They compare elite travelers with subaltern or marginalized migrants.
Yes. We have to look at the massive chasm between what Aiwa calls flexible citizenship and the reality of marginalized transnationalism.
Let's start at the top of the food chain. Flexible citizenship. What is the mechanism there?
So, Aiwa developed this concept by studying affluent, highly educated Chinese elites in the years leading up to the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China.
Oh, right. A time of massive geopolitical anxiety for people with money.
Exactly. These were individuals with immense capital facing uncertainty. Instead of just migrating in the traditional sense, they engaged in flexible citizenship. They basically treated national affiliation like a diversified stock portfolio.
That's a great way to put it.
The father might secure a Canadian passport and buy a home in Vancouver to establish a safe haven, get the kids into Western schools, all while he continues to spend 80% of his time doing high-risk, lucrative business back in mainland China.
So they are leveraging the stability, the rule of law, the schools of the Canadian state, while simultaneously extracting capital from the explosive economic growth of the Chinese state.
Exactly.
It's a pure arbitrage play on national borders. The border is just a tool they are actively exploiting.
It is mobility driven entirely by choice and leverage. They aren't trying to assimilate into Canadian civic life. They are using the Canadian state as an insurance policy.
That is elite transnationalism.
Right. But then Levitt and Khagram immediately force us to look at the other end of the spectrum. They feature the deeply moving and, frankly, ethically urgent research of Marcel Salazar-Paredes.
This is the research on Filipino migrant mothers, right? Which goes back to the scenario we opened the show with.
Yes. And the contrast is just jarring. Because if flexible citizenship is mobility driven by optimization, Perennius is documenting mobility driven by sheer economic desperation.
But it's more than just individual desperation, isn't it? It's a structural feature of the global economy.
It is entirely structural. To understand Perennius's work, you really have to look at the political economy of the Philippines. Starting in the 1970s, under the Marcos regime, the government realized they couldn't generate enough domestic jobs.
So what did they do?
They effectively institutionalized the export of their own citizens. They set up state agencies specifically to train, market, and deploy Filipino labor abroad.
Wow. To secure foreign currency through remittances.
Exactly.
So the state literally acts as a massive employment broker for the global north.
Yes, they do. And a massive portion of that exported labor takes the form of women traveling to wealthy cities in Europe, North America, the Middle East to do domestic care work.
So Perennius spent years doing this deep ethnographic research with these women, right? In places like Rome and Los Angeles.
And with the children they left behind in the Philippines, she maps out the brutal emotional mechanics of what she calls the global care chain.
The global care chain.
Yeah. A woman leaves her children in Manila to be raised by her sister so she can travel to Los Angeles to nanny the children of a corporate lawyer.
Which then allows that lawyer to participate in the high-end global economy. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We talk endlessly about the interconnected global economy in terms of software and microchips and banking. But Perennius forces us to realize that the absolute apex of the global economy, those dual-income tech executives in London and New York, is being directly subsidized by the emotional trauma of families in the global south.
It's a devastating realization.
Are we basically just building a global economy on the backs of outsourced care work? The wealth of the North is actively extracting the care and maternal labor of the South.
And that, too, is a transnational social field. But it's held together by Western Union wire transfers, WhatsApp video calls, and just a massive amount of suppressed grief.
It fundamentally challenges the celebratory tone that you usually hear in early globalization literature.
It really does. The global village has a basement, and that basement is full of outsourced reproductive labor.
Right. But when we talk about those wire transfers, the financial remittances that keep economies in the Philippines, Mexico, El Salvador afloat, the editors highlight another concept that totally rewired how we think about migration.
You're talking about Peggy Levitt's own concept of social remittances.
Yes, because we all know about financial remittances, the billions of dollars flowing from host countries back to sending countries. It dwarfs official foreign aid.
Easily.
But Levitt argues that if you only track the money, you are entirely missing the most disruptive export of all.
Levitt's research primarily focused on Dominican migrants living in Boston, and these folks maintained intense ties to their home villages in the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
She observed that when these individuals traveled back, or even when they just communicated by phone, they weren't just transferring wealth, they were transferring new social norms, new political expectations, models of behavior.
They were sending social remittances.
Exactly.
Break down how that actually plays out on the ground for us.
Yeah.
Because an idea is invisible, right? How does a social remittance change a physical village?
Let's look at gender dynamics, which is one of Levitt's prime examples. Imagine a woman from a highly patriarchal village in the Dominican Republic who moves to Boston.
Okay, so she enters the workforce there.
Right. She begins earning her own money. She navigates the U.S. healthcare system. She becomes accustomed to a culture where women have a more vocal role in community decision-making.
Yeah.
When she returns to her village, either permanently or just for a visit, she does not simply revert to the old patriarchal norms.
She brings that Boston-acquired social capital back with her.
She expects to have a say in how the family finances are spent. She expects different behavior from her husband. She might encourage her nieces to prioritize education over an early marriage.
Oh, wow. So it literally ripples through the family tree.
It does. Or consider the political sphere. Let's say a migrant spends 10 years organizing a neighborhood union in Massachusetts and then returns to a home country with a history of political corruption.
They aren't going to put up with it in the same way?
No. They bring back organizational skills, expectations of bureaucratic transparency, and just a much lower tolerance for authoritarianism.
It's essentially a cultural software update delivered directly into the heart of a community by a trusted insider.
A trusted insider is the key phrase there.
Right, because it's not an American NGO showing up in a white Jeep telling them how to run their town, which usually triggers immediate defensive resistance.
Exactly.
It's their own daughter or cousin or neighbor saying, hey, I've seen a different way this can work. But man, the friction that must cause between the returning transmigrants and the people who never left. That must be intense.
The friction is massive, and it drives social evolution. Levitt's main point is that you don't even have to migrate to have your life completely transformed by migration.
The non-migrants are experiencing it too.
The non-migrants in the sending community are having their daily realities radically altered by the social remittances flowing back from the diaspora.
Which naturally accelerates us into the third major pillar of the book's framework. Because if ordinary people are altering the political fabric of their home countries through these invisible networks, the traditional government sitting in their capital cities cannot just ignore it.
No, they can.
This fundamentally scrambles the architecture of global power. The state is suddenly dealing with a population heavily influenced by forces operating outside its jurisdiction.
And to map this new power dynamic, the volume relies heavily on sociologist Alejandro Portes. He made this vital distinction between transnationalism from above and transnationalism from below.
Because for a long time when people talked about globalization undermining the state, they really only focused on the view from above.
Right. Transnationalism from above is the classic Davos narrative. Multinational corporations, the World Bank, the IMF.
It's Amazon structuring its supply chain across 30 countries, or Apple parking its intellectual property in Ireland to avoid U.S. taxes.
Exactly. It is massive, formal institutions explicitly designing strategies to outmaneuver the regulatory power of individual nation-states. Macro-level capital restructuring the globe.
Okay, so that's from above. What about from below?
Portes documented that while the elites were doing that, ordinary immigrants were building a mirror image economy from the ground up. He conducted massive surveys of immigrant communities in the U.S. and found incredibly resilient, highly organized economic circuits that were completely informal.
And largely invisible to the state.
Totally invisible.
We're talking about like a Salvadoran immigrant in Washington, D.C., who pools capital with his extended family back in San Salvador to buy a fleet of courier vans.
Yes.
And they established this cross-border logistics company that operates entirely on familial trust and informal debt, completely bypassing formal international banking systems.
Or indigenous Mexican artisans in Oaxaca who bypass predatory formal export companies by utilizing a network of relatives in Los Angeles who act as direct distributors to boutiques in the U.S.
That's brilliant.
These grassroots networks move billions of dollars and sustain entire regional economies. And they do it by leveraging the transnational social fields we discussed earlier.
Because the trust required to run an international business without formal contracts is supplied by the social ties of the diaspora.
Precisely.
So you have corporations eating away at the state's power from above and grassroots immigrant networks bypassing the state from below. It sounds like the traditional nation-state is just being hollowed out, left as an empty shell.
A lot of people thought that, but the anthology pushes back against that narrative too.
And they use Saskia Sassen for this, right?
Yes, the brilliant work of Saskia Sassen. She argues that the state is not a passive victim of globalization. It is not just sitting there watching its power evaporate. Instead, she introduces the concept of the denationalization of state functions.
Denationalization, meaning the state is actively participating in its own transformation.
Exactly.
But why would a government willingly give up its own absolute authority? How does a state denationalize itself?
Think about the creation of the World Trade Organization or the European Court of Human Rights or massive international free trade agreements. These supranational entities didn't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
They were painstakingly built, legislated, and funded by national governments. The states explicitly created these higher authorities to manage the complexities of global capital.
But once created, those very frameworks now constrain the independent actions of the states that built them.
Yes. Sassen's point is that the barrier between the national and the global has collapsed inside the state apparatus itself.
So a government passes a law to join a global trade pact to boost its economy. But then 5 years later, when that same government wants to subsidize its struggling domestic steel industry, it can't.
Because the global trade pact it helped create says that's illegal.
The state bound its own hands to participate in the global system. You have central banks and finance ministries that are more closely aligned with the global financial system than they are with their own domestic labor departments.
Exactly. The global is inside the national.
And this collapse of the barrier between the domestic and the international creates incredible new tactical opportunities for everyday people.
It really does.
If the state is tangled up in international agreements and human rights treaties, activists can use those treaties against their own governments. Which brings us to, honestly, the most fascinating political mechanism in this entire deep dive, the boomerang effect.
Oh, this is a foundational concept. It was developed by political scientists Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink in their study of transnational advocacy networks.
They were looking at how human rights and environmental activists operate under highly oppressive regimes, right?
Yes. Under the old model of methodological nationalism, if you were a dissident group inside a dictatorship, you were trapped in a sealed box. You protest, the government cracks down, they control the media, they throw you in jail, and the story ends.
The state has a total monopoly on power within its borders.
But Keck and Sickink observed that activists had figured out how to break the seal on the box. When a domestic movement hits a brick wall with their own government, they don't just give up, they throw a boomerang.
They project their grievances outward into the transnational space. Okay, give us the classic historical example of how this actually plays out on the ground, because the mechanics of this are just incredible.
The most perfectly documented example, which heavily influenced this field, was the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 1994.
Right.
On the exact day the NAFTA trade agreement went into effect, an indigenous rebel group in the southern state of Chiapas declared war on the Mexican government.
They were demanding land rights and protesting neoliberal economic policies that would destroy their livelihoods.
Exactly. Now, historically, the Mexican military would have simply moved into the jungle, crushed the rebellion with overwhelming force, censored the press, and buried the story.
A purely domestic dispute resolved by state violence.
And they prepared to do just that. But the Zapatistas, led by Subcomandante Marcos, did something revolutionary. They didn't just fight a guerrilla war in the jungle, they fought an information war in the transnational space.
Right. They utilized early internet networks, fax machines, international solidarity groups.
They blasted their communiques directly to global human rights NGOs, university campuses in the U.S. and Europe, and the international press.
They threw the boomerang over the head of the Mexican military.
And the boomerang caught the wind of global civil society. Within days, you had massive protests in front of Mexican embassies in foreign capitals. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were mobilized.
The global media descended on Chiapas.
And this external coalition then applied massive pressure back onto the Mexican state. The U.S. government and international investors who had just signed NAFTA and needed Mexico to appear stable leaned heavily on the Mexican president.
So the pressure originates locally in Chiapas, flies internationally to global NGOs, and then comes swinging violently back to hit the Mexican government from the outside.
In the form of diplomatic and economic threats, and it worked.
The Mexican government was forced to halt the military offensive and enter into peace talks.
It fundamentally proved that civil society is no longer bounded by the nation state. Activists can leverage the transnational space to outmaneuver domestic tyrants.
It's an incredibly inspiring mechanism. But I want to push back on this architecture of transnational political power for a second, because it's not always a David and Goliath story, right?
No, definitely not.
Sometimes transnational power is wielded by people who are incredibly comfortable, and the effects are devastating for the people back home. I want to talk about diaspora politics.
The volume explores this extensively. When a migrant community settles in a new country, gains economic and political power, but continues to fiercely lobby regarding the policies of their homeland, they become a major geopolitical actor.
Right. And let's look at this impartially. The classic, perhaps most potent example in modern history is the Cuban-American diaspora in Miami. For over half a century, this community has exerted near veto power over U.S. foreign policy toward Cuba.
They successfully lobbied for and maintained a crippling economic embargo against the island.
Right. And this forces a really uncomfortable question about democratic legitimacy. If you have a powerful diaspora community living in relative safety and economic comfort in Florida, and they are dictating policies that result in massive economic deprivation, food shortages, lack of medical supplies for the people actually living in Havana, does that diaspora have democratic legitimacy?
It's a huge question.
Should people who do not bear the daily, on-the-ground consequences of a country's policies have a loud voice in dictating them?
It is one of the most intense ethical debates in transnational studies. And the scholars in this reader map out both sides of this tension very carefully without taking a side.
What's the argument against them?
Well, the political scientists who analyze this point out that diasporas are rarely representative of the homeland population. They often represent a specific economic class or political faction that lost power and left.
So when they lobby from abroad, they're essentially short-circuiting the domestic political process.
Exactly. They are amplifying extreme voices because they don't have to suffer the consequences of political gridlock or economic sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to demand a hardline, uncompromising stance against a regime when you are sitting in an air-conditioned house in Miami while the people in Santiago de Cuba are rationing cooking oil because of the sanctions you lobbied for.
But the scholars defending the legitimacy of diaspora politics counter that argument by pointing out the reality of authoritarianism.
Okay, what do they say?
They argue that the people inside Cuba, or Iran, or Eritrea do not have democratic representation anyway. The regime has silenced them.
Right.
Therefore, the diaspora, many of whom are political refugees who were tortured or exiled for trying to speak up, are the only ones who can advocate for human rights without being imprisoned.
They view their transnational lobbying not as a subversion of democracy, but as a necessary lifeline for a silenced population. They act as a proxy voice.
Exactly. They argue their human right to advocate for their homeland doesn't evaporate just because a dictator forced them across a border.
But the editor's broader point is that regardless of which side of the ethical debate you fall on, this reality fundamentally breaks our traditional definition of a citizen.
Completely. We used to think of a citizen as someone who lives in a territory, pays taxes to that state, and votes in its elections.
But now you have people who live and pay taxes in one country, but whose primary political identity and influence are fiercely directed at a country 1,000 miles away, which means the political map has completely decoupled from the cultural map.
Yes.
And that brings us to the fourth major paradigm shift in the book, the cultural blender. If political power and economic survival are this scattered, how on earth do human beings maintain a coherent sense of identity? What holds the community together?
It requires a shared cultural imagination.
Yeah.
And to explain how that imagination functions globally, Levitt and Khagram turned to the brilliant cultural anthropologist Arjun Appadurai.
Appadurai completely shattered the dominant 20th century model of how global culture works.
He really did.
Because the old model was basically the cultural imperialism theory. Right? The idea that the West, primarily the United States, was just this massive cultural steamroller. We were going to export Hollywood movies, McDonald's, and blue jeans, and it was going to flatten every local culture on Earth until the globe looked like a giant American strip mall.
Right, the homogenization theory. It viewed culture as a one-directional blast from the powerful center to the powerless periphery. But Appadurai looked at the data and said, that is not happening.
The reality is wildly unpredictable, deeply uneven, and incredibly messy.
Yes. And to map this messiness, he introduced a framework based on 5 different overlapping global flows, which he called scapes.
Scapes. Okay, I don't want us to just read the dictionary definitions of these scapes. I want to see how they actually collide in the real world. So Appadurai talks about the ethnoscape,
Right.
the massive shifting movement of people, immigrants, refugees, tourists.
Right.
And he talks about the finance escape, the blindingly fast, chaotic flow of global capital, currency markets, investments. How do those two flows interact?
Let's look at a catastrophic real-world collision, the 2008 global financial crisis. The crisis originated in the finance escape, specifically the collapse of subprime mortgage derivatives in the United States and Europe.
So a purely financial shock in the global north.
But within days, global credit markets froze. Capital stopped moving, and that finance escape instantly crashed into the ethnoscape in the global south.
Wait, let me make sure I get this. How did it hit the ethnoscape?
Because global credit froze, massive construction projects in places like Dubai and Qatar abruptly halted. Hundreds of thousands of migrant laborers from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who are building those skyscrapers, suddenly lost their jobs.
Oh, wow.
They were forced to return home en masse, triggering a severe remittance shock in their home villages.
So a toxic asset traded on a computer screen in Manhattan literally forces a family in Kerala, India, to pull their child out of school because the remittance check from Dubai stopped arriving.
Exactly. And then you layer on Appadurai's mediascape, the global distribution of information and images. The panic of the financescape was broadcast globally in real time across the mediascape.
Which triggered political instability and counter-movements, what he calls ideoscapes, as people demanded welfare protections from states that were suddenly bankrupt.
It's a perfect storm. Appadurai's genius was showing that these scapes are not aligned. They move at different speeds, and when they grind against each other, they create massive social friction and completely novel cultural combinations. Culture isn't a steamroller, it is a high-speed blender.
And if you are an individual living inside that blender, your sense of identity has to adapt.
Definitely. And the anthology draws heavily on cultural theorist Stuart Hall to explain this adaptation.
Stuart Hall is essential here, right? He argued that for a diaspora, identity is not some pure authentic artifact that you pack in your suitcase when you leave your homeland, and then you just preserve it under glass in your new country.
Identity is not a noun, it is a verb. It is a continuous process of negotiation.
You are constantly synthesizing. You aren't just 50% Jamaican and 50% British. The friction of growing up Jamaican in London creates an entirely new third way of being.
Exactly. And the sources point out that today, two of the most powerful structures helping people navigate this hybrid identity are transnational religion and digital media.
Talk about the religious aspect first.
The book emphasizes how crucial transnational religious networks are. When a Nigerian migrant moves to Texas, they might plug into a global Pentecostal network. This isn't just about Sunday worship.
It's a support system.
That church network operates as a massive transnational welfare state and social club. It provides job networking, legal advice for immigration, a dating pool, and an ideological framework that validates their life.
It allows them to feel connected to a global spiritual community that transcends the borders that are currently making their physical life so difficult.
Right. But layer the digital media aspect on top of that, because this is where the conversation gets incredibly urgent for today. The digital tether.
Yes. Historically, when you migrated, geography forced a severing. You crossed the Atlantic, you might get a letter from home once a month. You were forced to integrate into your new host society because you were physically cut off from the old one.
But today,
a migrant living in Berlin can be in a continuous 24/7 WhatsApp group chat with their extended family in Damascus. They can stream the evening news from their home country in real time. They can engage in fierce Twitter debates about a local election happening 3,000 miles away.
They are experiencing simultaneous digital presence and physical absence.
Exactly. So here is the pressing question, and I want to know what the framework says about this. So what does this all mean for integration? If you have a real-time digital tether to your home country, does that slow down your integration into a new host society? I mean, you are physically walking the streets of Berlin, but your mind is living in Damascus.
That debate is raging in sociology right now. But the transnational framework offers a very specific counter-argument. The perspective in this reader suggests that viewing integration as a zero-sum game is just another symptom of methodological nationalism.
Oh, interesting.
The old assumption was, you only have 100 units of loyalty. If you spend 60 units on your home country, you only have 40 left for your new country. Therefore, you are failing to assimilate.
But the transnationalist says that is a false binary.
Completely. Why does integration require cultural amnesia? A person can be highly integrated into the civic and economic life of Berlin, working as an engineer, paying taxes, obeying local laws, speaking German in the workplace, while simultaneously being deeply digitally immersed in the political survival of their community in Syria.
They aren't failing to integrate, they're successfully managing a transnational reality.
Exactly. The definition of what it means to be a functional citizen has to expand to include people who are deeply invested in two places at once.
That reframing is so powerful. It completely changes how we view immigrant neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But man, it also introduces a logistical nightmare, which brings us to the fifth major section of our deep dive. Catching the wind.
The methodology section.
Right. Because if people, cultures, and economies are this scattered, this hybridized, and constantly flowing across borders at digital speeds, how in the world do researchers actually study them?
This is where Levitt and Khagram do something truly exceptional. In an anthology filled with high-level theory, they dedicate a massive section entirely to methodology.
Which is usually the most boring part of an academic paper. It's the part you skip.
But here it is the most radical part of the book. By focusing on the how, the editors are proving they aren't just spinning philosophical poetry about a borderless world.
Right.
They are telling the academic establishment, if you agree that transnationalism is real, then every single research tool you have been using for the last century is broken, and you need to build new ones.
It's like trying to understand how the internet works by meticulously examining all the hard drives located inside a single zip code in Ohio, but you refuse to acknowledge the existence of Wi-Fi signals or fiber optic cables that connect them to servers in Tokyo and London.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Traditional methodology is blind to the network.
So how do they fix it?
The volume introduces George Marcus's concept of multi-sided ethnography. In the old days, an anthropologist went to a single village in Samoa, pitched a tent, and lived there for 3 years observing the boundaries of that specific community.
But Marcus argues that when the community itself is dispersed across 3 continents, the ethnographer can no longer sit in one village.
The object of study is no longer a geographical place, it is a flow. Multi-sided ethnography demands that the researcher must literally pack their bags and follow the network.
So if you want to understand a specific indigenous migrant community, you have to do field work in the sending village in Mexico. Then you must travel and embed yourself in the specific neighborhood in Chicago where they settled.
And then you must study the transit routes, the smugglers, and the border towns in between.
You have to map the entire circulatory system, not just the heart. But doing that qualitatively is hard enough. How do you do it quantitatively? How do you capture these invisible networks on a spreadsheet? Because standard national surveys are built entirely on that methodological nationalism we talked about at the start.
They really are. When a government conducts a census, they only sample the people physically standing inside the country's borders on a specific Tuesday.
Right. But if you want to understand the true economic resilience of a migrant community, drawing a random sample of people inside the U.S. completely misses the other half of the financial equation happening in El Salvador.
The survey design itself mathematically erases the transnational connection.
So what are the specific research tools they suggest?
The experts in the Reader discuss the absolute necessity of new statistical approaches. Things like snowball sampling.
Snowball sampling.
Yeah, where you find one member of a transnational network, and instead of stopping there, you ask them to introduce you to their contacts back home and their contacts in a third country, slowly mapping the hidden web of connections.
Okay, that makes sense.
And there's also a massive push to create linked data sets, where research institutions in sending countries and receiving countries actually collaborate, merging their separate national databases to create a unified quantitative picture that spans the border.
But wait, the moment you start talking about tracking people across borders, mapping their hidden networks, documenting their informal, untaxed economies, you run into a massive ethical wall.
You do. And this is the most sobering part of the methodology section. The editors are adamant that in transnational studies, methodology is never just technical. It is a matter of life and death. The ethical stakes are astronomical.
Because the people you are studying are often surviving precisely because they are invisible to the state. We're talking about undocumented migrants avoiding deportation, political dissidents avoiding assassination, informal entrepreneurs avoiding extortion.
Exactly. When a sociologist clumsily maps a transnational network of political activists and publishes it in an academic journal without rigorous anonymization, they aren't just publishing a paper.
They might be handing a targeting map to an authoritarian secret police force.
Or if an economist exposes the exact mechanisms of an informal migrant remittance network, they could trigger a massive crackdown by immigration enforcement that destroys the livelihood of an entire village.
So the researchers are essentially walking into the shadows, turning on a massive floodlight to gather their data, and then walking away, leaving those vulnerable people exposed to the state.
It demands a level of ethical rigor regarding consent, privacy, and data security that spans multiple legal jurisdictions. It proves that knowledge extraction is not a neutral act.
It carries immense real-world weight. Okay, we have covered an extraordinary amount of ground. We have dismantled the illusion of the map, analyze the human toll of the global care chain, the shifting architecture of state power, the cultural blender, and the perilous tools required to study it all. As we move into our final synthesis, I want to take this 2008 framework and slam it into the present moment.
And when you do that, you realize how incredibly prescient Levitt and Khagram were. The theoretical debates they curated 20 years ago are the exact diagnostic tools we need for the existential crises of the mid-2020s.
Let's look at the headlines today: digital migration and the decoupling of work from location.
The pandemic vastly accelerated a trend the book anticipated. We now have a massive class of transnational digital workers who physically reside in countries like Portugal or Mexico, but are completely integrated into the economies of Silicon Valley or London via fiber optic cables.
They are the ultimate expression of Iowa Ong's flexible citizenship, but democratized for the tech class.
Exactly, and completely confounding local municipal governments who don't know how to tax or regulate them.
And on the political front, we are watching the explosion of transnational populism.
Appadurai's ideoscapes are operating at terrifying speeds now. We see right-wing populist movements in Europe, the US, and South America actively sharing tactical playbooks, funding streams, and conspiracy theories.
A political grievance manufactured in one country is instantaneously translated, repackaged, and deployed to destabilize an election in another, completely bypassing traditional diplomacy.
But the text highlights one crisis above all others that absolutely demands this transnational lens, or we will fail to survive it.
The ultimate borderless catastrophe, climate displacement.
The editors were far ahead of the curve in recognizing that environmental justice is inherently transnational. Climate change is the final, brutal refutation of methodological nationalism.
Because a molecule of carbon emitted by a coal plant in Germany or a factory in China does not ask for a visa. It enters the global atmosphere, and the devastation it causes completely ignores geography.
And the devastation flows in the exact opposite direction of the wealth that created it. It is a profound structural injustice. The populations currently being displaced by rising sea levels in the Pacific or catastrophic desertification in sub-Saharan Africa are overwhelmingly the populations who contributed the absolute least to the historical carbon emissions.
The global north accumulated the wealth of industrialization, but the existential risk was exported to the global south. And when those displaced people are forced to move, when a farmer in Central America can no longer grow crops, because the rain patterns have permanently shifted and they are forced to cross a border, they hit a legal system that is still trapped in the 19th century.
Exactly. International refugee law, specifically the 1951 Convention, was built on the old nation-state paradigm. It expects a refugee to be fleeing a specific bounded political conflict like a civil war or a targeted genocide.
It does not legally recognize an unbounded atmospheric collapse.
A climate refugee has virtually no protected legal status in the international system because the system is designed to protect people from rogue states, not from a rogue climate.
The crises threatening our survival are entirely borderless, but our tools for governance, our laws, and our empathy are still stubbornly restricted to the neat little colored shapes on the map.
Which brings us full circle. Walking through the Transnational Studies Reader strips away the illusion that those shapes are the whole story.
It gives you the X-ray vision to see the invisible nervous system of the planet. You can now see how a mother's sacrifice in Rome sustains a family in Manila. You can see how a returning migrant rewrites the gender rules of a village.
You can see how an activist throws a boomerang over a dictator's head, and how your own identity is a constantly churning blender of global flows. The world is not a collection of separate airtight containers. It is a single vibrating web of intersections.
And mastering that transnational lens is no longer just for academics.
Yeah.
It is a fundamental requirement for navigating reality today. But the reality we are left with contains a massive unresolved contradiction. This is the thought I want to leave you with today.
Yeah.
The next time you look at the news or you look at a map, consider this. We have established beyond a shadow of a doubt that human life is transnational. Our supply chains, our cultural identities, our family networks, and our greatest existential threats like climate change flow effortlessly over those jagged black lines.
Whoa.
Yet every single mechanism designed to protect your life, your right to vote, your access to a hospital, your legal rights in a courtroom, your social security, is strictly locked behind the borders of a nation state.
Right.
If human existence has fundamentally outgrown the container of the nation state, but all of our survival mechanisms are still trapped inside it, how long can that contradiction hold? How much pressure can the system take before the very concept of citizenship shatters completely, and we are forced to build something entirely new from the wreckage? Think about that the next time someone asks to see your passport.